France looks calm on the outside. Cafes full, institutions intact, leaders speaking with confidence. But here's the paradox. The more stable France appears, the more fragile it's quietly becoming. What if the France economic crisis isn't a sudden breakdown, but a slow-motion unraveling we've been taught not to see? Behind the headlines and symbolism, debt and inflation are squeezing daily life, protests keep erupting, and trust in leadership is wearing thin. This isn't just another political crisis or another round of France protests explained away as routine unrest. It's something deeper, more structural, and more uncomfortable. The same model that once made France powerful is now under strain, and the Macron leadership crisis is only one piece of a much larger puzzle. What's happening in France reflects a broader Europe economic crisis and growing EU political instability. And that's why this story matters far beyond French borders. Stay with this until the end, because understanding France today helps you understand where Europe might be heading tomorrow. By the final chapter, you'll see why this crisis isn't about left versus right or Paris versus the provinces, but about whether an entire economic and political model can still survive in a changing world. For decades, France has been sold as the gold standard of stability, strong institutions, global influence, refined diplomacy, and a lifestyle the world envies. On the surface, it still looks solid: nuclear power, a permanent UN Security Council seat, and one of the largest economies in Europe. But scratch just a little deeper, and the France economic crisis starts to reveal itself, quietly at first, then all at once. What feels like stability is often just momentum from the past, not proof the system still works today. Anyone who's spent time talking to locals outside Paris hears a different story, one filled with frustration, fatigue, and distrust. Rising living costs, shrinking purchasing power, and a sense that decisions are made far away have become part of daily conversation. This isn't just about economy problems, it's about confidence evaporating. The political crisis didn't erupt overnight. It simmered, hidden behind polished speeches and reassuring headlines, until France protests explained the gap between image and reality. There's a familiar pattern here, one seen before major turning points. Institutions look strong right until they don't. Debt and inflation quietly chip away at trust, while France's social unrest becomes a pressure valve for deeper fears. What's happening in France isn't isolated. It mirrors the broader Europe economic crisis and growing EU political instability. And once that illusion cracks, the real question isn't if something breaks, but where the pressure escapes next. Once you move past the illusion, the mechanics of the France economic crisis become impossible to ignore. France runs one of the largest public sectors in the developed world, with government spending hovering around 57% of GDP, far above the EU average. For years, low interest rates masked the cost of this model, but that era is over. As debt and inflation rise together, the math stops working, and the economy problems stop being abstract. They land directly on household budgets. Inflation, which peaked above 6% in 2023, eroded purchasing power, even for middle-class families who once felt insulated. Wages didn't keep up, energy costs spiked, and food prices became a weekly reminder that something's off. Youth unemployment still sits stubbornly high compared to Germany, and competitiveness keeps slipping against both Northern Europe and emerging economies. This is how a generous welfare state turns fragile in a slow-growth world, when the promises remain fixed but the resources don't. Anyone who's managed a household budget knows this pressure cooker feeling. You don't collapse the first month, or even the first year. You stretch, defer, and hope. That's exactly where France is now. The Macron leadership crisis isn't just political, it's economic reality catching up with decades of assumptions. And when reforms touch pensions, labor laws, or benefits, they ignite something far bigger than spreadsheets. Because economics, sooner or later, always shows up on the streets.
This is the point where the France economic crisis stops being abstract and starts shaping daily interactions. Pension reform protests, nationwide strikes, blocked roads, and sudden urban flare-ups aren't isolated events, they're pressure releases. France protests explained often focus on laws or votes, but beneath them sits a deeper fear that the social contract no longer guarantees stability. When effort stops translating into security, frustration doesn't stay theoretical, it spills into public space. Immigration tensions intensify this unrest, especially in neighborhoods already under economic strain. In many working-class suburbs, competition for housing, jobs, and public services feed resentment, even when statistics don't fully support the fear. Integration failures, language barriers, and the emergence of parallel communities deepen mistrust, while highly visible episodes of urban unrest amplify perceptions of disorder. For many citizens, immigration becomes a symbol, not the root cause, of a system they feel slipping out of control. Anyone who's watched social cohesion weaken recognizes the pattern. Economic anxiety looks for a face, and immigration often becomes it. This phase of France's social unrest isn't just about economy problems or debt and inflation anymore. It's about dignity, fairness, and belonging. Once people stop believing the system can work for them, they stop protecting it. And when that psychological line is crossed, unrest doesn't fade, it reshapes politics in ways no government fully controls. By the time social anger reaches this level, politics rarely stays intact, and that's exactly what France is experiencing now. Trust in institutions has been steadily declining, with voter abstention hitting record levels in recent elections. The political crisis deepens as traditional parties weaken and anti-establishment movements gain ground on both the left and the right. In this environment, governing stops being about vision and becomes about survival. At the center of this storm sits Emmanuel Macron, facing what many now openly call a Macron leadership crisis. His reform-driven, top-down style worked when growth was cheap and global conditions were calm. But in an era of debt and inflation, every reform feels like a direct threat to someone's livelihood. Pension changes, labor laws, and fiscal discipline might make sense on paper, yet politically they detonate the moment they hit reality. Anyone who's tried to manage a team during a crisis knows this pattern. When trust collapses, even good decisions look suspicious. France finds itself stuck in a loop. Reforms are necessary to fix economy problems, but attempting them fuels France's social unrest, which then paralyzes governance. This paralysis doesn't stay contained within borders. It feeds directly into EU political instability, raising uncomfortable questions about leadership, legitimacy, and what comes next. Looking ahead, the France future outlook sits at a crossroads, not a cliff, but the choices narrow fast. One path leads to structural reform, modernizing labor markets, rethinking public spending, and restoring competitiveness without tearing the social fabric apart. The other path is stagnation, where short-term political survival overrides long-term fixes, and the France economic crisis becomes a permanent condition rather than a temporary shock. France's struggle also acts as a warning signal for the rest of the continent. As Europe's second-largest economy, France doesn't stumble quietly. Its challenges amplify the broader Europe economic crisis and expose the fragility of EU political instability, especially as nations disagree on debt rules, fiscal integration, and economic sovereignty. Anyone watching European markets can already see uncertainty replacing confidence. History shows that countries don't break from one bad decision, but from years of postponed ones. France still has enormous assets, human capital, industrial depth, global influence, and cultural soft power. The unresolved question is whether its political system can adapt fast enough to unlock them again. And that question doesn't stop at France's borders. It defines what Europe itself might become next.
If there's one takeaway from France's growing crisis, it's that stability is never permanent. It's negotiated over time. The France economic crisis,
the political crisis, and the expanding France social unrest all point to the same reality. Systems built for yesterday struggle under today's pressures. Debt and inflation are no longer background noise. They shape lives, expectations, and political limits. The deeper question is personal as much as political. How much pressure can citizens absorb before trust collapses? How long can governments delay reform before unrest becomes structural? France's experience forces viewers to rethink assumptions not just about France's future outlook, but about Europe as a whole. The Europe economic crisis and EU political instability suggest these tensions are connected and far from over. So now it's your turn. Can France reinvent its model without losing social cohesion? Is this a warning for other countries walking the same path? Share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because understanding these shifts today is how you stay ahead of what comes next.